When it comes to global economics, China's debt to many African nations has been a contentious issue. In fact, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen spoke passionately about the issue when she visited Africa in January 2023, accusing China of creating a debt trap for poor African nations. Even the International Monetary Fund, shortly after Yellen's visit to Africa, began conversations on restructuring Zambia and Ghana's debt under its G20 framework. 7 African nations were identified by the World Bank as being in financial trouble or in danger of going into debt distress in 2020 as a result of the volume of Chinese financing. A research report released by Chatham House, an English establishment that helps people, societies, and governments understand and adapt to seismic change, in December 2022, shows the top 20 recipients of Chinese loans in Africa. It is important to note that the figures presented by Chatham House are based upon loan commitments and should not be regarded as equivalent to African government debt. In this video we have covered the top 10 African countries with the highest debt to China, and without any further ado, let's jump into it. Coming at number 10 is Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire has a long track record of large-scale international borrowing, and the country turned to China as a source of funding for some strategic infrastructure projects in recent decades. In terms of volume, Côte d'Ivoire received 25% of all Chinese ODA from 2000 to 2017. In 2020, Côte d'Ivoire's sovereign debt exposure to China is estimated by the World Bank's Data Reporting System, DRS, to be $3.1 billion, or roughly 5% of GDP. Infrastructure constructed by Chinese companies has mostly been financed by loans. The economic and financial strength of Côte d'Ivoire allows it to borrow like an emerging market rather than a low-income nation. The management of French infrastructure loans and investments by Côte d'Ivoire dates back many years. So using Chinese loans to construct roads, ports, dams, and bridges has been a continuation of a tried-and-true strategy.
Before we continue, welcome back to Be Amazed 254. If you are new around this paths, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to never miss an upload. This is the #1 channel on the internet where amazing people come to watch. Also, you can show us some love by giving this video a like.
Number 9, Ghana with an estimated debt of $5.3 billion. Ghana stopped making payments on its external debt in December 2022 and is now asking the IMF for a $3 billion bailout, which it intends to get by the end of June. Over time, the public debt of the nation has risen from 20% of GDP in 2006 to 78.3% in June 2022. Obtaining a bailout from the IMF will be more difficult than ever before, economists predict, due to the lack of transparency around Ghana's loans to China and the requirement that pension funds participate in domestic debt restructuring. In March 2022, the Chinese Foreign Ministry said that China's official bilateral loans involving Ghana account for less than 5% of the West African country's total debt. Germany's finance minister recently singled out China during a visit to Ghana, as he called on countries that have lent to the embattled nation to form a creditor committee quickly to help it restructure its debt. The country's opposition has involved the IMF to help look into the country's debt. At number 8 is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Given its abundance of valuable natural resources and minerals, the DRC could easily rank among the richest nations in the world. However, the nation has suffered consequences from resource looting, such as ongoing strife. It owes an estimated $5.4 billion in debt. The DRC was quick to exchange mineral resources for loans with China. Number 7, Sudan. The conflict-torn country has an estimated debt of over $6.1 billion. Although China has written off the country's debt incurred in 2015, it still has a long way to go. According to the Financial Times, the amount owed by Sudan to China as of the beginning of 2022 was $5.12 billion. This figure does not include obligations that must be settled using oil from the country, much of which is already past due. Number 6. Cameroon. China has issued over $6.2 billion in loans to Cameroon, the majority of which broadly concern infrastructure and energy. The majority of these loans are for major projects that are at least partially funded by the Cameroonian government. Although it was recently made public that China was in discussions to reduce some of the debt owed by the nation, nothing about China is definite. Cameroon's possible inability to pay its obligations to China became clear when Yaoundé was unable to adhere to certain of the terms of its loan, which led to further difficult financial circumstances that started in 2017. China is still Cameroon's biggest debtor, notwithstanding the temporary rescheduling of debt payments. The difficulties that Cameroon will face regarding its debts to China will only increase going into the mid-2020s when large sums of debt are due to be serviced. Coming at number 5 is Nigeria with a Chinese debt of $6.7 billion. Nigeria's debt to China has grown by 209% in the last 8 years amid rising poverty across states, according to an analysis of data by Business Day. According to data from the Debt Management Office, DMO, China loans account for 84.73% of Nigeria's bilateral debt, while the rest came from France, Japan, India, and Germany. The DMO said loans from China are concessional loans with interest rates of 2.5% per annum, a tenor of 20 years, and grace period of 7 years. Experts say low revenue and rising interest payments have left Africa's largest economy with almost no money after paying interest on debt. In the absence of a significant boost in oil revenues and tax reforms, the World Bank forecasts that Nigeria's fiscal deficit will remain above 5% of GDP until 2025. The loans from China are concessional, which means they are given at more generous terms than market loans. 11 projects are funded by the money, according to the debt office. These range from water supply, power and railways to airport terminals, communications and agricultural processing. The Nigerian financial publication Nairametrics warned about falling into a Chinese debt trap because of Nigeria's problems with corruption. Number 4, Kenya. Chinese debt $9.2 billion. Between year 2006 and 2017, Kenya borrowed at least 1.1 trillion Kenyan shillings, equivalent to $9.8 billion from China. Chinese debt accounts for 21% of Kenya's foreign debt and 72% of the country's bilateral debt. China lent Kenya funds to build highways and a railway between Mombasa and Nairobi totaling over $6.5 billion by 2020. Kenya reportedly came close to default on Chinese loans to develop its largest and most lucrative port, the Port of Mombasa, in late December 2018. Kenyan media have debated whether Chinese loans are worth the risk, drawing analogies with the experience of Sri Lanka and saying that these loans could jeopardize Kenyan sovereignty. At number 3 is Zambia with a debt of $9.8 billion. Based on 2018 statistics in The Economist, China probably holds 1/4 to 1/3 of Zambia's external debt, comparable to other creditors, such as the US and the World Bank. That year, Zambian lawmakers debated whether Chinese loans put Zambian sovereignty at risk. According to Africa Confidential, ZESCO, Zambia's state-owned power company, was in talks about repossession by a Chinese company. The Zambian government denied ZESCO privatization allegations. In July 2022, a committee of creditors co-chaired by China and France stated that they were committed to negotiating a restructuring of debt with Zambia under a G20 framework. Zambia's total public debt to foreign and domestic lenders was just shy of $34 billion at the end of 2021, around 133% of GDP, according to the IMF. Number 2, Ethiopia. Ethiopia has an estimated $13.7 billion in debt to China, much of it advanced by China Exim Bank. The Chinese capital has funded the $4.5 billion Addis Ababa to Djibouti Railway, along with other projects like the capital's Riverside Green Development as well as the light rail network. Debt was reportedly one of the issues under discussion when Ethiopian Finance Minister Ahmed led a high-level delegation to China in February this year. In 2018, the Paris Club of Sovereign Creditors called for a creditor committee to be formed quickly to restructure Ethiopia's debt, increasing pressure on China to engage under a new joint G20 framework to grant debt relief to poor countries. Finally, at number 1 as the most indebted African country to China is Angola, with estimated debt of over $42.6 billion. Most of Angolan oil is going towards the repayment of Chinese debts, despite Angola being the second largest producer of oil in Africa. China's debt exposure to Angola has accumulated dramatically over the last 20 years. After the civil war ended in 2002, reconstruction was the Angolan government's top priority. China provided significant assistance by kickstarting over 100 projects in energy, water, health, education, telecommunications, fisheries, and public works, backed mostly by oil loans. The IMF had estimated that the Angolan government debt-to-GDP ratio stood at 86.4% in 2021. Angola has actively engaged with key creditor countries on adjusting its debt financing facilities, but renegotiation of the terms of its oil-backed loan repayments to China has been opaque. Angola has also benefited from the spike in oil prices in 2022, which has assisted repayment of loans, as the terms of the moratorium with Chinese lenders reportedly required repayments to resume if oil prices rose above $60 a barrel. According to Finance Minister Vera Daves de Souza, the country paid $1.32 billion in repayments to China in 2022.